Ladies and gentlemen, recently my book From Holy War to Global Peace is published in Pakistan. It is a collection of my essays that focus on the psychology of suicide bombers, guerrilla warriors, and peacemakers. Today I'll share with you my introduction to the book. It is titled Killing in the Name of God. This essay was written in October 2001, just after the 9/11 tragedy. And we all know that tragedy, the 9/11 tragedy, shook the whole world, and all the people from the East and the West, from the Muslim and the non-Muslim backgrounds, had gone through a process of soul searching. And this essay is the outcome of my soul searching that I would like to share with you. Killing in the name of God. There was a time I believed in holy war. I believed all non-Muslims were my enemies. I was willing to give my life for a holy cause. And I was willing to kill in the name of God. Now when I think about those years, a cold chill runs down my spine and I feel ashamed and embarrassed. How could I think like that? How could anybody think like that? How can anybody believe in a merciful God and then be so cruel to take a human life? How can anybody kill a human being and then consider his cause noble and holy? When I see the pictures of Kabul, Afghanistan, and Peshawar, Pakistan, appearing repeatedly on the television screen, my mind fills with the images of my past. That is the part of the world where I spent my childhood, my teenage years, and my young adulthood before I immigrated to the Western world. The day American President George W. Bush decided to attack and bomb Afghanistan and asked Pakistani President Pervez Musharraf to support him, I felt perturbed. I thought back to the days when I wanted to join the Pakistani army and fight a holy war against India, against Hindus, against my enemies. I vividly remember filling out the enlistment forms and putting them on the table for my dad to sign. Those forms stayed there for 2 weeks, unsigned. I assumed he was so busy that he did not have time to read them. Finally, with the closing date approaching, I asked my dad, "When are you going to sign those papers?" "I'm not going to sign them." I was shocked at his brief but firm answer. "Why not?" "I don't want you to go to the army." When he saw my puzzled look, he asked me to sit down and he tried to explain his position. "Dear son," my dad said, "by signing these papers, I will be giving you permission to kill. If you join the army, you will take an oath that if your commander says shoot, you would shoot. If Pakistan ever had a war with Iran or Afghanistan, then you might be asked to kill your Muslim brothers and sisters. I cannot give you blessing to do that." After listening to my dad's lecture, I got up without saying a word and left the room. I was disappointed in him. I did not understand his rationale. I was preoccupied with our Hindu enemies in India. I had never imagined the possibility of going to war with Iran or Afghanistan. After that disappointment, I always considered my dad idealistic rather than realistic. But when President Bush declared war on Afghanistan and asked for the support of the Pakistani army, I realized that my dad was far more far-sighted than I. When I asked myself, why did I want to join the army and fight a holy war? I am reminded of the 1965 war with India. I now believe that war made lasting impressions on my 13-year-old psyche. When I reminisce about that phase of my life, I remember that in 1965, political tensions had started to escalate between India and Pakistan. The dispute with India over Kashmir had surfaced again. The sparks of rivalries and prejudices finally turned into flames, and both countries declared war on the 6th of September. The whole nation's life was turned upside down. Nobody knew how to deal with the major crisis. The government declared a complete blackout after sunset. No one was allowed to burn a match, light a candle, or turn on a lamp, which could give enemies clues where to bomb in the middle of the night. Everybody soon became accustomed seeing in the dark. People were encouraged to dig trenches close to their houses so that they did not have to travel far and waste time carrying their children to safety at odd hours of the night. It was also suggested that the trenches be made in L, V or W shapes so that even if people sitting in one wing were affected, the others would be protected. The whole nation was in a state of emergency, with everybody scared and unsure about their safety and the security of their families. It was interesting for me that people who had hardly talked to each other prior to the crisis started making plans to dig trenches together. The men of the families living around us decided to dig them outside our courtyard because they were afraid small children might fall into them. However, digging them outside the wall meant that due to the proximity of the river, water appeared in the trench at a depth of 3 feet. The whole area seemed to be waterlogged. Finally, they dug trenches that were eye-shaped. They were not very satisfactory, but something was better than nothing. At least they had enough room for women and small children, while the men used to sit outside. Even people from the neighboring streets came running down when they heard the siren. I will never forget one incident in the middle of the night when the siren had sounded and everybody had come rushing to the trench. The women and children were huddled in the trench and men were crouching outside on the flat ground. Suddenly one of the neighbors, and I still remember his name, Muhammad Sharif, started to shake and shiver. He was so afraid, he was grinding his teeth. One of the women felt so sorry for him that she came out and asked him to jump into the trench. He was utterly embarrassed. He was caught between the fear of the bombs and shame at wanting to sit with the women. Finally, fear won out and he crawled into the trench. That day, I vividly remember thinking, that day I realized I never wanted to become weak and vulnerable and afraid like Muhammad Sharif. I wanted to be a mujahid, a brave and strong holy warrior who could sacrifice his life for his faith. The declaration of war changed the psyche of the whole nation. People became very patriotic and religious. Political leaders made patriotic speeches. Maulanas, the religious leaders, preached special sermons, and poets wrote stirring patriotic songs, the taranas, sung by popular singers. Many people offered special prayers for a Pakistani victory. They believed it was a holy war, a jihad, which they wanted Islam to win. Many nights I saw Indian planes dropping bombs and flames leaping to life in the destroyed targets. The neighborhood was often shaken by the staccato of our anti-craft guns firing at Indian planes, creating havoc in the skies. One night, after seeing an Indian plane, a villager got so overwhelmed by his religious emotions that he tried to shoot down the plane with his rifle. And unfortunately, the whole village got bombed. We saw the ruins and ashes the next day. It was so sad. The whole village paid the price for one man's fanaticism and stupidity. In those days, people became so religious that it spilled over into superstition. And there was talk of miracles. One of the stories was that when an Indian plane dropped a bomb near the river Attak, People saw an old man in a green robe with a green cap catch a 1,000-pound bomb in his holy hand and quietly drop it into the river. People believed it was one of the miracles of Islam. People were so emotionally involved that it was not uncommon to see hundreds of men and women lined up in front of shops all over the cities listening to the war news. That war ended in 17 days, and the public was made to believe that the Pakistani army had won. One of the heroes who received a number of medals and awards for his extraordinary performance in the war was a pilot named M. Alam, who shot down 6 Indian planes in 56 seconds, less than a minute. Those were the days when the whole nation was proud of their army and air force. I was no exception. After the war, the intoxication with patriotism and religion remained for a long time like a sinister hangover. To enshrine it in the national psyche, the 6th of September was declared a national holiday. I was so impressed at the age of 13 by that war heroes that I wanted to join the Pakistani army myself and fight for my religion and become a hero like M. Alam. When people ask me, how did your holy war consciousness transform into peace consciousness, I keep quiet. I find it hard to answer the question in a few sentences. I think it was a gradual process. Over the years, I discovered that we all have multiple identities, and some identities are more significant than others. Like many other Muslims, I considered my religious identity to be primary and my ethnic, linguistic, and cultural identity secondary. Eventually, I realized that inside Islam there were sub-identities because of different sects in the Muslim world. The strongest sects were Shiites and Sunnis. I was shocked to discover that those identities were so strong that people were ready to kill each other in the name of God. For many years, on the 10th of Muharram, a special day of mourning for Shiites, there were violent confrontations between Shiites and Sunnis in numerous cities, in which many people died. I also read about the centuries of holy wars between Muslims, Jews, and Christians throughout Europe and the East. I gradually realized that religion divided people into believers and non-believers, and that many religious people had a tribal mentality. Some of them identified so strongly with the tribe that they were ready to go to war with followers of another tribe, another religion, and call it a holy war. Now I find it hard to believe that for many years I was one of them. There was a time I used to wonder what my religious identity would have been had I been born into a Hindu family in India or a communist family in China. There was a time I used to wonder what my religious identity would have been had I been born into a Hindu family in India or a communist family in China. In the journey from a religious attitude to a humanistic outlook towards life, a number of writers, philosophers, and mystics guided my way. The first writer who challenged my thinking was Saadat Hasan Minto. He had written thought-provoking stories about the 1947 tragedy following partition, in which thousands of innocent men, women, and children were slaughtered on the altar of religion. In one of the stories he wrote, "Why do you say 100 Muslims went to heaven and 100 Hindus went to hell? Why don't you say that we lost 200 precious human lives?" Minto was the first intellectual with a humanist attitude which made me aware that all human beings were equal and their lives were sacred. He helped me respect other people's faiths and beliefs and lifestyles. His writings put a dent in my conservative, traditional, religious, tribal thinking. After Minto, when I read the teachings of Buddha and the writings of Kabir Das, I could not imagine how I could hate the followers of such peace-loving philosophers and poets and mystics. Buddha helped me discover the spiritual dimension of life. He said, "Once own experience is the ultimate teacher. And Kabir Das, Bhagat Kabir, helped me transcend religious traditions and institutions and embrace all of humanity. He writes in one of his poems, O Brahman, I say only what I have seen with my own eyes, and you keep quoting the scriptures. I speak to unravel the mystery, but you insist on keeping it tangled. How can our paths cross? Buddha and Kabir Das, like many other mystics, helped me discover my own path and respect other people's truth. They taught me to accept that there were as many truths as human beings and as many realities as pairs of eyes in the world. As I traveled through India and met wonderful writers and intellectuals and ordinary people who welcomed me with open arms and hearts, I discovered that Hindus were my brothers and sisters. When I traveled in the Middle East, I realized that Muslims, Christians, and Jews were all children of Abraham, and being followers of the monotheistic tradition, they had more similarities than differences. And when I traveled in Europe, the West Indies, North America, South Africa, I discovered that all human beings share the same moon, the same sun, the same winds, the same mountains, and the same oceans. Gradually I realized we are all children of Mother Earth, members of the same tribe, the same family, the human family. Now when I turn on the television to see Afghanistan being bombed, I feel so thankful to my dad for not signing those papers. It was interesting that years later, after I became a doctor, my dad asked me once, "Son, do you still want to join the army?" "Why do you ask?" I asked my dad. "I would have no objection if you wanted to join the army now. As a doctor, you would be a healer, not a murderer. You could even help your suffering enemies." That day, I realized that my father was a humanist at heart, as he loved human beings and humanity. He was a wise man. Years later, I remembered my dad when I read Walt Whitman's poem that he had written in the Soldiers' Hospital in Washington while working as a volunteer with the wounded soldiers of the Civil War. He writes in one of his poems, and I quote, "For my enemy is dead. A man divine as myself is dead. I look where he lies, white-faced and stiff in the coffin. I draw near, bend down and touch lightly with my lips the white face in the coffin." That poem helped me see a human being even in my enemy. It helped me see the unity in our diversity, a common bond of humanity we all share as human beings. To kill other human beings in the name of a merciful God is the ultimate contradiction human beings experience individually and collectively. We as human beings have our dark sides and we have a potential to kill. Throughout history, human beings have been killing other human beings for personal, social, national, and political reasons. I believe that the most tragic killings are those done for religious reasons. The worst wars are holy wars, as they're fought in the name of a compassionate and merciful God. In the end, I would like to share with you a quotation from Krishnamurti as he highlighted that contradiction in these words. J. Krishnamurti says, "The men who dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima said God was with them. Those who flew from England to destroy Germany said God was their co-pilot. The dictators, the prime ministers, the generals, the presidents all talk about God, and they have immense faith in God. Are they doing service, making a better life for man? The people who say they believe in God have destroyed half of the world, and the world is in complete misery." Unquote. In the present international tragedy, when we read the speeches of Osama bin Laden and George W. Bush, we are struck by a number of similarities. Each believes he is fighting for justice and peace. Each believes the other is a terrorist. Each believes he is on the right path. Both have declared a holy war and are willing to kill innocent people. One calls it a crusade and the other a jihad. Both believe God is on their side. Thank you very much.